Hey, Gwilym, it seems like an absolute age. How are you, mate?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm living on optimism and coffee. It's my kind of strategy at the moment.
I knew coffee would come in there somewhere.
You got all the stories though, Lee, so let's just dive straight in with exciting stuff. I want to hear about two things. I want to hear about the current state of international squash and your Jag.
And my Jag. Should we start with the Jag?
Go on.
It was like the crime scene investigates thing outside the house the other night, because my Jag normally lives up my drive, obviously, because I look after it. She's 25 years old, not many miles, but getting on a bit. So I look after her lovingly. And I just dropped one of my daughters at her boyfriend's on Friday night, about 9:30, parked up outside. I thought, I won't put the car away because I've got another daughter to go and pick up at about 11 o'clock. So I just left it on the road. So I go in, grab a cup of tea, got a cup of tea, sat down on the sofa, and then I heard we're at the bottom of a hill, but it's a normal road, it's a normal road. It's not like a difficult road to drive or anything like that, but at the bottom of a hill, and we heard screeching wheels that seemed to go on forever. The noise just seemed to last forever, but it was only a couple of seconds apparently. And then an almighty crash, which sounded like a bomb going off. And I just turned to my wife and said, "Mine's the only car out there."
Oh.
So yeah.
What sort of Jag have you got, or did you have, Lee?
Simon, no one knows you're on the podcast yet.
But you can expect Simon to come in. He's a petrol head. You need to answer his question.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I had an XJR. I had an old XJR. So love it.
So how's the XJR? And it's now an XJR.
It's now an XX. So four lads, I don't know if I'm allowed to say all of this because there's a police investigation going on as we speak. Four lads in a Mercedes that was too big for them to obviously drive at their age had come down the hill. There's a little route through our village that we live in from a pub, and it's quite often used as a rat run by people. And they had come hurtling down the hill. The police estimate, so the police have got doorbell footage, which is brilliant, isn't it? So they've got doorbell footage across a number of kind of critical incidents. So they've worked out the speed. So the speed was between 60 and 70 on a small road that, even 30 is probably too fast, generally, because of people walking dogs and stuff like that. They lost control about 200 yards from my place, and you can then trace it back. So there's skid marks on the road. You can see where they hit a lamppost. And that sent them on a trajectory that was straight at my Jag. And my Jag ended up in my neighbour's drive.
Oh, good grief.
Sentinel on that crash is not funny. It's a motorway crash, isn't it? And you mentioned that you said there were some lads who were too small for the Mercedes. I've got a picture of 9-year-olds peering over the
No. I meant that they were too juvenile, as in too young to be driving a car. It was a 3.2 Merc.
How'd they get that? They pinch it?
Well, no, apparently not. So it was insured, taxed, MOT'd, not reported missing or stolen. I'm imagining that someone's dad woke up the next morning thinking, "Oh, what's happened here?" So I was going to swear then, but no, what's happened here? Because the guys who got out of I was quite annoyed with my neighbours. I was in a little bit of a state of shock myself. It's my Jag. So I walked up the end of the drive, looked at the kind of the mess that was there, and my immediate next door neighbour said to me, "Go and phone the police." So I went back in and phoned the police. And then by the time I got back out there, the four lads had scarpered. Now, I don't know how they scarpered, and I was annoyed with the neighbours because they should have wrestled them to the floor, obviously, and sat on them and stuff like that.
I definitely would have.
Which they didn't do. But the guy who was driving, I don't know how he's got legs left, because the front of the Mercedes had all crumpled into the footwell. There was no footwell left. There was no space for legs to be, so I don't know how he had legs. And the front seat passenger had hit the windscreen. And you could see this because there was a head-shaped dome outwards in the windscreen and lots of blood.
And they legged it.
They legged it. Apparently slowly, my neighbours told me.
No, you can't leg it without legs. They travel the way.
They went slowly up the road. Why didn't you stop them? Yeah, so we had the whole.
You've talked about that, Jag, a few times. I'm really sorry to hear that.
It's my baby. It's my baby.
Modern car hitting an old car. So I think there aren't people involved. Old cars beat modern cars, don't they? Because old cars are just more rigid.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
the other way around, isn't it?
I mean, the police said that. One of the police guys that arrived said, look, if you've been driving it as a head-on, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Because you look at the state of your Jag, and it's a write-off, but you're getting out of that. Whereas you look at the state of the Mercedes, and it was like, not a lot left of it at the front.
Anyway, welcome to this week's episode of Top Gear.
Hey, you had another question, but I can't remember what it was.
What is the state of international squash, Lee, and how would you know this?
How would I know? Well, I know nothing about squash. I just play it badly. No, there is that. Now, last week was the Canary Wharf International Squash Tournament. So Me and number 3 son, who is like best squash player in the family, used to be me, but now it's number 3 son. We thought we would take ourselves up to London for the Canary Wharf tournament, so we did 2 days up there. Absolutely amazing. Loved it. Thoroughly loved it. I know the guy who organises the UK squash tour, so we had like a VIP bar box that. We didn't have to worry about the fact that there were glass walls. We were up high enough to have a really decent view and lots of beer.
So it's been a roller coaster of a week. Highs and lows.
Yeah.
Lee Davis and Willem Roberts are the 2 IPs in the pod, and you are listening to a podcast on intellectual property, brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys.
And now I've bought myself a midlife crisis car anyway, so.
I did see, talking to Top Gear, I'm sure they had a whole episode about how any convertible 4-seater should only be driven by a dictator.
Hey, well, I've got a convertible 4-seater now, so maybe I'm a dictator.
Emily.
Anyway, so, you said we were going to do a podcast today. Should we do it?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, okay. So we thought it was about time we took a look at the life sciences, because it's been in the IP news and in the news generally, and we've got 2 members of SEPA's Life Sciences Committee with us. We've got the chair, Simon Wright, and we've got Dev Crease with us. So welcome both. Simon, do you want to briefly introduce yourself first?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Lee. Good to be on the podcast with you guys. It's really nice of you to ask me. I suppose I've been doing stuff with SEPA and being involved with SEPA for many, many years. Well, really, since I joined the profession. So I got involved with the informals, and I suppose I organised the moot one year. I did organise the lectures one year. I ended up becoming the honorary secretary, which actually is great fun because you get invited to their annual Christmas dinner every year until you pop your clogs. And then I got into life sciences, and I took over the chair of the Life Sciences Committee from Anna Denholm when she became SEPA president. And I suppose I then graduated and wanted to join council as well. And now I'm on the patents committee and in with the ILC, the International Liaison Committee. So yes, I suppose I've really enjoyed being involved in SEPA and what it does and supporting it for decades. And I suppose I have similar roles in the EPI. I'm on the EPI Council as a UK member, and I'm secretary of the biotech committee in the EPI, and I'm on the bylaws committee. So occasionally I get some work done. They pay me to do some jobs, and
who pays you? Who pays you? Who gives you all this time off to do these things?
Well, Schlick does now. Yeah, that's it in about my involvement with the institutes in a nutshell, I suppose.
And what about you, Dev? Let us know who you are.
Well, thanks very much, Lee. And Simon's already thanked you on my behalf, so I'll thank you again. I'm much less interesting than Simon. I'm a frog embryologist by original training. That didn't go so well, so I became a patent attorney. And I trained, I've been in the job for about over 20 years now, but I trained with a firm called Mathers and Squire, very famous firm in London, and I now am a very happy member of the partnership at a firm called Kelty. And we're next door to Mathers and Squire as it stands. Mathers and Squire are in the Shard, if you know London geography, the big pointy building, and we're in the building just on London Bridge. So every time there's a movie that you see, one of the Avengers movies or James Bond or something, they always pan in on the Shard, and then I bore my wife by pointing at the building at the bottom of the Shard and saying, "That's my office."
I interviewed with Richard Lawrence, one of your colleagues, I think. It's the counterweight for the Shard. It's to stop the piece of land that the Shard's on from flipping over or something. Is that true?
That's the kind of thing Richard would know, and I would just nod sagely and go, no, I'm sure that's correct. As a mere biotechy person, I don't know about engineering.
Hang on, tell me more about this frog thing. So,
the frog thing.
Had you not been a patent attorney, had you not ended up being a patent attorney, where was frog embryology taking you?
Well, yeah, the frog embryology is actually a very important and underpinning discipline within the field of developmental biology, which is the science of how we develop from an egg into a multicellular organism that's capable of ruining the planet. But we to use model organisms, and in order to study various stages of development. Mice are one area, and people use zebrafish. They use fruit flies, Drosophila, and Xenopus, which is an African claw-toed frog, is one area. And I had the pleasure of working with a very well-known, he's a Nobel Prize-winning scientist in Cambridge called John Gurdon, and he's still going today. Even he's been active in biology since the early 60s, probably late 50s. So he's a brilliant embryologist, but he allowed me to bask in his glory for a short period of time during my PhD.
A completely pointless observation. Why don't they just call it tadpology?
Tadpology. Oh, that would have been a great title for my PhD.
Say something sensible now, Lee. Sorry.
I was going with some Spawn thing, but I stopped.
That's one on my list.
It makes it sound like some heavy metal album, doesn't it?
Cheers, Dev. Well, Simon, Dev, you're both really welcome on the podcast. I know we want to get into the work of the Life Sciences Committee and talk a bit about what you're doing for us on a day-to-day basis. But Simon, I thought just easy kickoff question for you, if that's okay.
Sure.
You talked about coming onto SEPA Council, and SEPA Council is often a mystery to people. It might still be a mystery to you. I don't know. How do you find Council? Try and sell it to people who might be thinking about it.
Oh, well, I suppose we meet the first Wednesday of every month. And I suppose for me, it just gives a really good insight as to what SEPA is doing, what's going on in the IP world, and what you're up to. Because I think if you're not on Council, you do actually miss a lot of the behind the scenes, the issues that are being considered, what SEPA does. And to a certain extent, I'm not sure SEPA really blows its own trumpet enough sometimes, because there is some pretty serious stuff that goes on in SEPA Council that gets aired. And I think the membership don't always appreciate what we're doing and where's SEPA going. I think it's a brilliant institution, and it does a lot for the IP professional members. There's so many committees as well. There's so many people that are inputting and using their vast expertise and experience. It's really quite a scary place to be, because a lot of these people are far smarter and more intelligent than I am. And I go along to SEPA Council meetings and they come out with something and you think, well, that's amazing. That's really clever. Why don't we go and do that? And they've got real vision and creativity. So it's a great meeting place from that point of view.
So I apologise for being far smarter and more intelligent than you, but that's just the way it rocks.
I say that to lots of people.
It was interesting what you say about not blowing our own trumpet. Sometimes that's because we're not very good at blowing our own trumpet, and I accept that entirely. Most of the time, though, it's because we're dealing with stuff we can't talk about, and that's what I think people don't appreciate sometimes with Council. If you think about, you'll know this. If you think about the last couple of years we've had around issues to do with Brexit, to do with trade agreements, to do with the UK's ambitions to join existing trade protocols such as CPTPP, we've been involved in all of that, but we often can't talk about it, and we can't talk about it for good reasons, and that's because we're in very sensitive discussions with senior members of Parliament and government officials and others, and it's difficult to blow our own trumpet. So it's good to hear you kind of say generally that the Council is a good thing. It's doing good stuff.
And SEPA members everywhere, if you're sitting there doubting what SEPA's been up to, if something bad that could have happened hasn't happened, it might have been us.
we may have just stopped
that's very difficult, isn't it? Because as you say, a lot of it is sensitive, it's political, and you can't shout about it. And I suppose you can tell the membership that you've headed off an existential threat, but you don't want to be labelled a bunch of dinosaurs either.
So you make it sound like there's a man in black.
Oh, there is. Yeah.
I would still go and he's a patent attorney. We can't talk about it.
I think one of the things that I often find is that people don't realise how important or how pervasive intellectual property is. So when you are representing SEPA, and sometimes we write position papers or we file arguments on behalf of SEPA at various international bodies, and people go, why are the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys interested in this? And they don't realise that actually that intellectual property interfaces with so many areas of commerce and science and strategy that it's really important actually to speak up.
I think that's a really great point. And without sort of straying into the political arena, we're recording this, of course, 4 weeks into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the government's approach to sanctions is hopefully starting to bite quite heavily and will or won't have an effect on the outcome of that conflict. But IP's been a big part of that. And we've been doing a huge amount of work behind the scenes to try and understand how the concept of putting in place sanctions against a country can then be translated into a series of actions that patent attorneys can actually make use of in terms of the way they address their business models, the way they advise clients, etc. And all of this happens behind closed doors. So you're absolutely right. IP cuts across everything, even down to military conflicts such as the one we're seeing currently.
Well, I suppose in the end of the day, IP is an amazing blend of both business and finance. It's commercial and technical at the same time. So it's going to span a lot of interests and parts of people's lives. And we're already seeing, for example, in Russia, they're basically saying, well, you can ignore IP rights of right holders, whether it's trademarks or patents. So yeah, you're right. Even a conflict as dreadful as this one has an IP angle to it.
It is the first time I've seen IP so politicized, I must say, actually.
Do you think so? That's the first time. Don't you think the first time, most recently, was around the vaccine?
Oh, that was neatly done, Lee. Good segue.
It's what I'm paid for, mate.
Power play by Lee. Actually, I'll answer my own question. Look, it's a really good point. But no, it's interesting. I noticed some international organizations are currently struggling with what to do about the Russian chapters in the IP world. Of course, if they've got other jurisdictions aren't placed quite the same in relation to the current conflict, and so they're having all kinds of issues. It's odd. It's first time for me, except, as you say, for the vaccine waiver.
Yeah, so we've seen quite a lot of activity around council. Again, some in the public domain, some not. Where should we start, Simon and Dev? Do you want to give us some kind of overview of the life sciences perspective on? Well, let's even go back a wee bit. Let's go back to the pandemic, it starting, and how we came to develop a vaccine and stuff like that. Over to you two, really. Just kind of take us through how the Life Sciences Committee's seen that.
Well, the Life Sciences Committee has kind of, I suppose, a pretty general and wide remit. I mean, it's not just life sciences or biotech. I suppose we look at SPCs, we're looking at biodiversity, sequence listings. We have a pretty wide remit, really.
Can we just talk vaccines, though?
Talking vaccines, yeah. We have a very diverse membership as well. And that's an interesting thing because we have members from big pharma, we have private practice and smaller mid-sized companies as well. So you have to understand that, intellectual property is two sides of a coin. We're not just representing one group of industry. We have to be very open to the fact that it's the wider industry as well. And of course, the biotech industry and the pharmaceutical industry are very interesting in that they're made up of these very well-known, big, large companies that probably are the ones that you buy your drugs from or veterinary products or whatever. But they're also fed by a very diverse ecosystem of smaller companies, smaller startups, spin-outs from universities, serial entrepreneurs that all contribute to generating what's known as the pipeline. And the pipeline is new drugs, new therapies, new diagnostics, and all of these things that are sort of validated and then picked up by the bigger companies. Because back in the 1950s, 1940s, the big companies would have had big research divisions of their own with staff chemists. But I think in the 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot of that a lot of that ended, and they've become. I mean, I think some of the big companies now, I think it was AstraZeneca, even describe themselves as an IP holding company to a certain extent, in that they do a lot of in-house R&D to some extent themselves, or working up products, but they buy in and they spend a lot of time looking for new therapies from these smaller companies and smaller biotechs. And so when you talk about things like the vaccine waiver, which I think this idea of patents are bad, patents prevent dissemination of technology, and it's all big pharma that are creaming off the profits. What you have to understand is that the patents are an essential tool from small startups all the way through to the big companies, because if you're at the beginning of an innovation phase, you don't have clinical trials, you haven't invested in all of that cost, and what you actually have is the intellectual property as your prime asset. You've got some key individuals, their know-how, maybe some trade secrets, and it's the combination of the intellectual property that makes this smaller or mid-sized company interesting, and that's what pharma is often buying into. So, there is quite a pervasive concern around this idea of just saying, well, we're just going to ignore IP where it applies to certain areas of science, because you're almost saying, well, we're removing the incentive, the commodity that smaller and mid-sized companies need in order to interface and interact with the bigger companies. And then you're placing all of the burden on the bigger companies and saying, well, you need to do the innovating, but without any IP protection. You need to do it for sort of public benefit. Because, I mean, I guess the other side of it is, well, if you remove the incentive for the companies to the commercial incentive for companies to innovate, then who's going to do the innovating? And is it going to be the universities? Is it going to be the NHS? Is it going to be some other international charities or something? I mean, we haven't quite figured out, well, what if, and that's the problem, because everything costs money, unfortunately, doesn't it? I mean, making one of the things that I think we learned from the pandemic, when the various different countries were trying to source starting materials, was that actually making a vaccine is a very complex thing. Involves delivery platforms. So the mRNA vaccines all have to be encapsulated in a fatty lipid capsule, and then that has to be manufactured in one country, and it has to contain certain ingredients, and they all have to be biocompatible, and then you have to make the messenger RNA in a different country, and then you have to combine them somewhere, and you have to formulate them and put them into glass vials. I mean, one of the things that was I found quite amusing was last summer I had to have a window replaced in my house, but I was told by the glazier that there's a shortage of glass around the world because it's all being used for making vials for COVID vaccines.
Wow.
And yeah, so if anybody was trying to glaze anything, you hit this sudden supply shortage because of the need for glass. But that tells you, there's so many different elements that have to come together to make a pharmaceutical product, and to say, well, we're going to waive the patents, which is one key aspect of the motivation to commercialize, is it's quite a blunt tool, I think, and there might be better ways of doing it. I don't know, Simon, what you think.
Yes, I mean, I think fundamentally I agree with you in the sense that as soon as you start waiving patent rights, quite how you would implement that, and you decide which ones and by how much, but you remove the incentives for innovation. And people put money into R&D in the hope that people won't copy them. But if you then start taking the patent rights away, then they'll start thinking, well, why should I be doing this in the first place? I think one of the other interesting things about the pandemic is that it's clearly it's educated the public not only about vaccines and science in general. It's massively increased the impact of science and in the general public's eyes, and people are talking all about vaccines and strains of viruses, and these are sort of conversations you'd hear in a queue in a shop when you're getting your groceries at Sainsbury's, but that's the sort of conversation you would never have heard a few years ago. And then of course you have the vaccine waiver, and that hits the headlines, and everybody then people saying, well, patents are bad, they shouldn't be allowed on these certain vaccines and certain technologies, and it's amazing how much this has, I suppose, reached the general public, and that's one of the few perhaps good things that has come out of the pandemic.
Good and bad, I think you're absolutely right that the knowledge is better. I did hear a good joke from somebody saying, I've just become a complete expert on vaccines. Now I have to learn about Ukrainian defense policy. but yeah, I think that the risk is that the kind of the abiding memory from the full discussion is patents are bad, which is really, really worrying. They're not perfect. We had a podcast on this a long time ago now. And, it was a very balanced discussion about the pros and cons. And the conclusion there was, as you say, there's a huge supply chain issue. There were all kinds of reasons for the vaccine inequality, very political and economic. And the role of IP in stimulating the innovation in the first place may have been a little bit underlooked. But the debate hasn't gone away, has it? I mean, I gather the WTO, we're going to have a meeting about this over Christmas, which ironically was cancelled because of COVID. I can't work out whether that's the virus protecting itself again, or whether I couldn't work out whose side that was on. But it continues. But the discussion goes on. I think this education requirement is hugely important, actually. Of course, the patent system could be improved, and of course, things could have gone better. The focus should much more be on, where could we improve the patent process rather than with the patent process at risk, because it doesn't seem to have been the fundamental issue.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has generally worked in other areas of technology is patent pooling, and that's one area where I think perhaps we should look at facilitating. In this sort of very specific area of the vaccine, we could look at the equivalent of standards essential patents, but for vaccines or vaccine production. Of course, technology transfer is as much as important as the patents. I mean, you can waive the patents, but people still can't make vaccine without access to materials, without a detailed understanding of the know-how behind how you go about manufacturing messenger RNA that can be put into people's arms and not cause a sort of horrendous reaction. It's not a simple thing to do. There are a lot of modifications and things that have to be made along the way in order to make these things work, which is the first priority, and then not hurt people. Those are the two sort of, I guess, primary features around pharmaceuticals and any kind of therapeutic, which is different to a lot of other areas of technology.
I suppose patent pools for vaccines is a prime example, really, because for in particular for that product, you've just got so many aspects to it. You've got the obviously the active ingredient. You've got the formulation. You may have patents on the manufacturer. You might have a vast number of patents that cover one particular vaccine. So there you are probably talking about patent pools, which would considerably ease the problem, because you may have so many patents on different aspects of that one particular product or its manufacture.
I think one of the conclusions from that conversation we had last time, Lee, was that patents as a tool for collaboration is perhaps a really positive area to explore. Although I suspect everyone's petrified about the idea of wave of vaccine frand. That could be the future. But, I'm going to say something which may be controversial, but I think that one of the benefits of patent pooling in the telecom sector is that everyone can afford a phone that works around the world. There's some, simplistic statement, but it does seem to have worked for the consumer.
I can't afford a phone that my daughters want that works.
This is true.
Join the club, Lee.
Absolutely. That there are definitely ways. I mean, I always think, the patents, particularly in the life sciences area, the patents are an easy thing to target. But actually, what you need to be looking at is more about technology transfer. Is about the industry in general. Is about the approach. I mean, it's exploitation. It's the way people commercialize things that we would need to look at. But they always say, "Oh, well, patents are bad because it's this kind of standard bête noire." I think they're a slightly more nuanced understanding probably would help the situation further. And actually, that's what we want to do. I mean, I don't think many people are out there are saying, well, no, we shouldn't be sharing technology. We shouldn't be spreading vaccine to the areas of need. Patents probably.
I think it's ironic that when you're talking about vaccines, one of the most important things you need if you're going to manufacture a vaccine is know-how. And know-how is actually something that's very, very difficult to protect.
Dev, can I ask a question? So one of my jobs on the podcast, being the non-IP person, I mean, I've worked in it for 10 years now, so I kind of know my way around it. But I still like to feign ignorance at times, just to help kind of move us into a particular area. You talked right, you.
Feign away, Lee, feign away.
It was an Enya song, wasn't it?
Feign away, feign away, feign away. Yeah.
It was 20 minutes or so ago we started talking about this. You talked about the genetic beginnings of the pathogen, you know, the COVID thing coming along. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, wow, you know, in order to start to work on a vaccine, you need to work on the bug, the germ, the virus. The virus comes from somewhere. Does someone own COVID? Does someone actually own the genetic resource that is the original kind of COVID infection?
Well, that's a really good question. And it sounds a bit bizarre to think that anybody or anyone or any institution could own something as all pervasive and international now as COVID. But there is this legislation that's sort of spun out of the Convention of Biological Diversity, the CBD, which does kind of provide a form of sovereign ownership of biological resources. And the CBD is an interesting international treaty, and it's very laudable. And you know, being as I said, you know, a former frog embryologist, as a zoologist, as if you will, at the higher level, you know, there's nothing I believe in more passionately than conserving biodiversity. I don't think anybody thinks that's a bad thing. The CBD is intended to conserve biodiversity, promote sustainable use of bioresources, and also to provide fair and equitable sharing of benefits. And that is the point that I think answers your question, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits, because in 2014, there was a sort of addendum to the CBD, which is called the Nagoya Protocol. And this basically states that if you're a country that's a party to the Nagoya Protocol, and that's pretty much most countries in the world except the USA, that you have a sovereign right over the genetic resources that are originating from your country. And this was originally intended to stop what they call biopiracy. So there were a few instances probably in the 1990s where some companies would go to places like the Amazon or parts of South Africa or in the lesser explored regions and would go bioprospecting. So they would find local indigenous people, they would ask them about their traditional knowledge, their traditional medicines, they would find the tree or the plant or the animal that was the source of the alleged properties, and then they would take it away, sequence it, try and find the active ingredients, and then commercialize it. And out of that kind of behavior it became quite, you know, pressing for many of these developing nations who felt they were being exploited, and rightfully so, that they wanted to have some form of access and benefit sharing. So if a cancer drug was derived from some bark from a tree in the Amazon, that the people who knew about that property originally ought to have some form of royalty paid back to them. And that kind of idea has snowballed into the Nagoya Protocol, which now says that if you have a non-human genetic resource, so that's anything that contains hereditable material, so DNA, RNA, proteins even, that are extracted from a non-human organism. So that's everything from a soil organism to an animal to a plant. And you commercialize that and turn it into a product, then you have to enter into an access and benefit sharing agreement with the country of origin. And now that's all around the physical material. So if you take physical material from, say, an African or an Asian country, and you go to that country, you you obtain the samples, you bring them back to the UK, you work on it, and you develop a product, then you have to, by law, by British law, there is a law that was sort of brought in. It was a EU directive, but it's now been sort of ported over following Brexit into UK law, that says that you have to have entered into access and benefit sharing. So yes, that does cover pathogens. That does cover the original samples of COVID, and it does raise a sort of question around, I guess, monetization of biodiversity and the monetization of pathogens, which is something that has become quite a hot topic with COVID now. Is that, you know, there are allegations that some countries are holding back on sharing information about potential pandemic or endemic pathogens in order to make sure that they don't lose out on the commercial benefits arising therefrom. Now, the one thing I think we would say that was an amazing strength or a very positive outcome from the pandemic was the level of international scientific cooperation that managed to get vaccines developed in an incredibly short period of time, and also vaccines that were based on novel or new technologies that had not really been used very widely in human populations. So the mRNA vaccines, I mean, that's a whole new area of therapeutic delivery that we've all got inside our bodies now. And I think if you put in the way of that, you put in some legal mechanism that says, hang on a minute, you can't share information, you can't share samples. That is quite worrying. So there is a question, I guess, around whether or not the Nagoya Protocol perhaps represents a concern for present and future public health. You know, and at the moment we're still in a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic for COVID. We're also, for animal health, we're in the middle of a pandemic for avian flu, which may not have much of an impact on the majority of us, other than the fact we can't get free-range eggs now. They're all barn reared because if you own chickens, you can't have them outside. But you know, these things come very quickly, and certainly within living memory, we've had swine fever, we've had foot and mouth disease, and this is just in the veterinary sense. And they're saying that more and more potential coronavirus type pandemics could come. What we really need to, I think we really need to be doing is having systems where cooperation and sharing of information, certainly for public health and animal health, is promoted. And we sort of move away from this idea where countries feel that they own life, they own the life within their borders, and then they can monetize that.
Well, I'm glad I asked that question.
That was a long answer, wasn't it?
Wow.
Well, we've kicked this around the Life Sciences Committee. I mean, the irony is that, you know, if China was the first one to, well, it depends on what you believe as how it, arrived on the planet, whether it was through pangolins in markets or it was through the Wuhan, genetic engineering facility. That China might actually have rights to the original COVID-19 variant. And then, of course, you're talking about various strains and mutations that develop and arise in other countries. I remember, what was it, the second one? I think it was called something like the Kent variant. They started calling them from the places that they were first identified before they started talking about, they went to a politically neutral Greek alphabet. But it's an interesting thing to think about whether the UK would have owned rights under the Nagoya Protocol in the Kent variant.
Well, the thing is, the UK government doesn't enforce its Nagoya rights, which is I think an altruistic decision, because promoting access to and freedom of information and access to genetic resources is considered to be an important policy mission of the government. But I mean, if you took it to its logical conclusion, if you think every non-human piece of DNA that is manipulated within a UK research laboratory, bearing in mind that the UK, probably aside from USA, is probably one of the leading locations for life sciences in the world. If the UK government suddenly decided to apply its Nagoya rights, you wouldn't be able to send any material overseas without agreeing an access and benefit sharing agreement and royalty with the UK government on anything generated in the labs of any university or any research, it's not something that they would do because I think the worrying thing is what happens next, because the proposals that are currently being considered, and this is at the moment, it looks like it's probably a likelihood that it may well happen, is that at the moment, Nagoya only relates to physical material. So that's physical material that's procured or shared or sent between countries. What they're looking at doing is extending that to digital sequence information. So it will be sequence information. And that's almost like a form of copyright that would be perpetually owned by the countries that originate it. And so, a lot of companies that are sort of looking to develop, whether it's be, products like, artificial vegan cheese might be a good example. You might want to do sequence studies in the databases to look at enzymes that are useful in processing milk-like proteins, and you do big sequence searches, and typically they'll do big sequence comparisons, and then they might take bits of some enzymes and put them together to create a hybrid, and then they'll maybe evolve that further to try and improve its yield. All for a fairly mundane purpose, which is making vegan cheese. But if those sequences that are uploaded into that database come from a variety of microbes from around the world, can you imagine the price you have to pay at the end of it if you're using a little bit of a sequence that came from Indonesia and a little bit of a sequence that came from India and a little bit of a sequence that came from somewhere in Africa or South America? You could end up creating a product that has got so many royalties stacked on top of it, it becomes impossible to actually commercialize. And that's from not even going to any of these countries and not even prospecting or taking traditional knowledge. That's just from doing AI crunching, machine learning type crunching in your lab, sitting on your laptop in a coffee shop in Oxford or somewhere. And so the sort of the reach through is reached a level where you're thinking, well, it's bizarre. It's really, really quite strange that we feel this need to sort of constrain the freedom of science. I don't think, if you actually look at the Nagoya Protocol and the Convention on Biodiversity, they don't always talk about monetary benefits. That they do recognize that there can be non-monetary benefits, which is the freedom of information and the ability to transfer technology from developed nations to less developed nations. But unfortunately, a lot of the dialogue is around taxing the biotech industry and the pharma industry because they seem to be making too much profit, and there's a need to redistribute the wealth, and this is one of those mechanisms. That's a policy thing, and I wouldn't want to get sort of bogged down in saying whether wealth redistribution is right or wrong, but is taxing early stage companies the right way to do it? I don't know.
Policy's come up a lot today, and we talked about the politicization of IP, and you mentioned some of the idea of sovereign rights to IP as well. And actually, there's a really interesting theme there, because we talked, one of the issues with vaccine waiver, it's there because of what they're calling vaccine nationalism. We've talked about Russia kind of basically extending its compulsory license regime as a kind of a counter sanction, if you will, and then the Nagoya Protocol as well, which is also. I wonder whether there's a connection here that it's not very healthy when nation states start taking on IP rights, as it were. That seems to be, there might be a theme now. I've not really thought about it before, because it seems to be quite a new development, I'd say. But apart from during wars, with all the crown rights stuff, you don't normally see that. But Lee, I mentioned to you in the chat, I've got quite a good joke. Is now a good time?
There's never a good time, but now feels like the right time.
I was just going to say that the Nagoya Protocol was intended to have some very beneficial effects, but there's some downsides, which is quite Nagoying. That was the joke.
Yeah. So hang on. So in the chat, it says to me, I've got a big Nagoya Protocol joke. And the joke was Nagoya and annoying.
No, Nagoying.
Yeah, I get that bit, but that was a big joke. I thought there was going to be some deep kind of philosophical sort
I'm Nagoyed about it.
That's almost a podcast in itself. isn't it? Nagoya.
No,
Nagoya.
it's really not.
You have kicked off quite a few extra podcasts here, Deb.
Oh,
but,
blimey, absolutely. I mean, I'm just thinking we could keep going, or we could kind of take some of this stuff out and come back again. I'm conscious, Simon and Dev, we've been going for a fair old while now, probably one of our longest recordings yet, but we've only touched on a couple of areas of the Life Sciences Committee's work. Is there other stuff you wanted to get across today before we think about wrapping it up? We can come back. We can come back and we can do more. Is there anything else you want to get in now?
Maybe Dev can comment more about this. I suppose we also deal with SPCs. I mean, we have a good relationship with the Patent Office. We have an excellent annual meeting with the UK Patent Office. So we have a couple of examiners, some senior policy people, and they meet the Life Sciences Committee, and that's a good annual meeting where we discuss all sorts of, I suppose, interesting practical topics, how the law is changing, how the practice is changing. So that's a very good, I suppose, avenue and interaction with the Patent Office. And we have similar things with the EPO. I suppose the other hot topic is at the moment, and this is very political, is all about the plant patenting and the changes in the rules about stopping patenting of plants being made by biological processes. So, we get involved in quite some highly charged political things because I suppose the Greens and the plant lobby have been, very vocal and in some ways quite successful at getting the law changed in the way they want to. So, yeah, we have quite a lot to do, but it's lots of fun.
I'm going to get this entirely wrong now, but I remember one of my first experiences of coming to CIPA in a council meeting was when we were talking about, I'll get it entirely wrong, but it was something like crinkly cucumber 2 or some such thing.
No.
What
wrinkly tomatoes, Lee. Wrinkly tomatoes. Wrinkly tomatoes.
I was close.
Well, now
Dare I ask what was that about?
All sorts of other plants. Yes, it's whether they're patented. You can't patent a plant variety, but you can patent a plant at a sort of genetically or higher level.
Yes, because everybody wants wrinkly tomatoes, and that's. I wouldn't object to a patent waiver on wrinkly tomatoes personally.
Well, the invention was just basically leaving tomato on the vine so it just dries up and wrinkles.
It's kind of a tomato raisin.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose they do the same with grapes.
Yeah, don't try and patent it though.
No, but you can make good wine out of it, Gwilym.
Guys, it's been absolutely brilliant having you on. I do think we could probably go on. I think it's my job probably to bring us to a close, though, so I'm going to do that. I think we're probably going to ask you to come back, if that's okay, maybe at some point in the future and talk about some other stuff the Life Sciences Committee's been involved in. Maybe when it comes to the next conference, Simon, perhaps that would be a good time to come back and talk about some of the stuff that's coming up at conference, which would be really, really good.
That'd be great. So thanks very much for having me on. I'd love to come back.
Oh, no, thank you both. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
Much.
Hey, Gwilym, I was going to tell you this right at the start, but I thought I'd save it to the end. Albert's awake.
He's arrived.
He is. It was so lovely today. I thought
Is it the car alarm that woke him up?
I thought I'd go. No, it wasn't. No. I thought I'd go and get him out of his cold box in the garage. He's popped him in the garden, and I gave him some kind of crumpled lettuce, some bits of kind of leftover cucumber, and some wrinkly tomatoes that were in the fridge. And he's devoured the lot. Absolutely amazing. It's amazing how you can go from being asleep-ish for the best part of 4 months to then stuffing your face. There's a lesson in that for all of us. Thanks, Dev. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Gwilym. You've been your normal self. And I'll see you on the next one.
You mean Nagoying?
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, all.